welcome to those who are joining. We're about to get started. I'm just gonna admit more people as we get going here. And we appreciate you're here. If you can remain muted, that would be great. All right. All right, hopefully I can introduce Sean here and admit people at the same time. Okay, all right. Welcome everyone, a couple more coming in. All right. So just give it, all right, welcome Amy and Chris. And everyone, thank you for being here today. I'm gonna get started, and if I see some other people in the waiting room and my eyes divert here, then you'll know why. My name is Amy O'Neill, and I'm the Director of Development and Alumni Relations at Alpha Sigma Nu. We welcome you today to our Lunch and Learn webinar. We are very excited for our speaker, Sean Sanford, to talk with us today about Ignatian spirituality and leadership in today's world. I think before I introduce Sean, I just have to acknowledge and I want to share in the horror and the pain of the senseless shooting and loss of life yesterday in Texas. We pray for the victims, their families, the school, and the whole community of Uvalde, Texas. As we move into our presentation, I know our hearts are all very heavy today. I just had to acknowledge that before we move forward. I would now like to introduce Sean, our speaker, Sean Patrick Sanford. For over 25 years, Sean has served as a pastoral minister, nonprofit executive, consultant, and coach. In addition to his role as Director of Leadership and Young Adult Programs for the Office of Ignatian Spirituality, Sean is the founder and President Emeritus of the Center for Faith Justice and founder and chairman of the Two Hawks Foundation. He's a graduate of St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia and is the recipient of the university's Ignatius Award for embracing the Jesuit ideals of living a life of service to others consistent with the principles of St. Ignatius Loyola. And he served as St. Joe's president of the National Alumni Association from 2016 to 2018. His graduate research studies focus on American religious history, sexuality, and political theology. Coming to work for the Jesuits in 2015, Sean developed an umbrella initiative called Ignatian Young Adult Ministries, where he leads a team that directs charis, contemplative leaders in action, and Jesuit connections. The Young Adult Ministries team serves over 3,000 people in 20 US states and 5 countries, and currently participating in the Executive Leadership Coaching Program at Georgetown's Institute for Transformational Leadership. Sean continues to explore his lifelong passion for leadership, spirituality, and the common good. So we're so excited that you can be with us today, Sean. And just a reminder to everyone, if you could please keep yourself muted. And if you have a question, you can use the raise your hand feature and we will try to get to your questions. So thank you so much and welcome, Sean.
Thanks, thank you. I appreciate it. And it's always weird having people read the introduction that you write for yourself, but I appreciate you doing that. I'm happy to be here and be with you all. I thought before I jumped in, we could just start with a moment of prayer. So if we could simply pause for a moment. And remembering the needs and the petitions that are close to each of our hearts, in a particular way, the victim of yesterday's mass shooting, the families in their grief, the community in its shock, and for our leaders who apparently lack the ability to find a meaningful solution, we pray together. Grant me, O Lord, to see everything now with new eyes, to discern and test the spirits that help me read the signs of the times, to relish the things that are yours and to communicate them to others. Give us the clarity of understanding that you gave Ignatius. Amen. I stole that from Pedro Arrupe, so I can't take any credit for it. So as Amy said, my name is Sean Sanford. I live in South Jersey, about 30 miles east of Philadelphia. I am a proud alum of St. Joseph's University. I graduated 25 years ago this week, which doesn't feel possible, but it is. Clearly, I was interested. Oh, I got a thumbs up there. I was very interested in making money, so I studied philosophy and art, and that clearly worked out for me. What I wasn't was a member of Alpha Sigma Nu, which my friend John, who threatened to be here, he is a member of Alpha Sigma Nu, said if I don't tell you all, he was going to raise his hand and do it instead. So there you go. So my sort of professional journey in part is informed by one of my professors at St. Joe's was Father Joe Feeney, longtime member of the English faculty. And I remember him explaining to me this idea of Ignatian humanism as a freshman or a sophomore and not really understanding what he was talking about. And somewhere towards the end of my senior year, he and I were having a coffee, and something had happened in that final year where the synthesis of all these different ways of looking at the world from a liberal arts education had started to come together. And I remember being excited because that was for me the moment where I realized that was the way I wanted to approach the world, was looking at it multidimensionally and trying to find the way that things can be brought into conversation with one another. So I really think of my work in spirituality and leadership as a synthesis of my experience educationally and personally and professionally so far. So just by means of a very, very quick background, I got into leadership development work. I had been working in pastoral ministry for a number of years, and was asked to become an executive director of Vincentian nonprofit organization at 30, and really in my hubris said yes, and I realized how much I had to learn about leadership and managing people. That organization closed down after a few years, and I ended up founding a different organization. And in the meantime, by virtue of trying to learn myself how to become a better, more effective leader, I ended up doing consulting with dioceses and parishes and schools and other nonprofit organizations. So I kind of fell into leadership development and found that it was really what I felt very passionate about it. And I continue to feel that way. So as Amy mentioned, I work for the Office of Ignatian Spirituality, which is a ministry of the Eastern Province of the Society of Jesus. We do a number of different Ignatian spirituality initiatives, but I oversee the young adult programs and the leadership programs. And it's been a real honor to work with such awesome people, because leadership is actually one of the pillars of OIS's mission. I should also mention, I am a very bad farmer. I live on a small organic farm in South Jersey, and I'm very bad at that part of things. So anyway, having said that, while my vocation is centered around spirituality, leadership, and this kind of pursuit of the common good, I don't describe myself as an expert in leadership or spirituality. I just feel like I'm really passionate about putting Ignatian spirituality and leadership development and ethics into conversation with one another. And I believe that there's a growing discourse on Ignatian leadership as a concept over the past few years, and it suggests that we have a lot that we can learn from this tradition. What it's not, and I think this is important to say, is it's not simply just putting an Ignatian spirituality gloss on leadership or a leadership gloss on Ignatian spirituality. It's about putting them in dialogue with one another. So the last thing I want to mention before I kind of dive into my topic is one of the things I tell the participants in Contemplative Leaders in Action, which is a 2-year community-based cohort of young adults who are doing a deep dive in Ignatian spirituality and in leadership, is that they are part of an emerging global conversation on what Ignatian leadership is. The book has not been definitively written. Father Bill Barry and then Chris Lowney years later were major contributors to advancing the conversation, but it is a conversation, and it's taking place around the world. I was recently on a podcast and someone said, like, what happened in the last 5 years that all of a sudden everyone's talking about Ignatian leadership? And I said, I don't know, but I'm glad it's happening. So I would say that we're all part of that conversation too. And my preference for today would be, if you have some of your own experience about these connections, throw your hand up. We'd love to hear about them, or if you have questions or feedback, please don't hesitate. So with that, I just want to jump in a little bit. I'm going to try and cover a number of different things in a fairly short amount of time. So why lead like Ignatius as a title? As many of you probably know, in the decades since the Second Vatican Council, there's been a look back to the founders of a number of different religious communities in the Catholic Church, not least of all St. Ignatius of Loyola. For many of us, the story of the soldier saint who founded the Society of Jesus is truly fascinating, in part because of the impact he's had, and he and his early companions have had on the church in the world, but also because I think his insights continue to resonate with us nearly 500 years later. So I think it's also telling that there's a lot of people in the leadership who do leadership scholarship, whose contributions, a lot of the experts that you'll find on the business lists on leadership, are either people with military backgrounds or often religious backgrounds, and St. Ignatius was someone who had both those backgrounds. So I think it's kind of telling that we're starting to look at him as what is his contribution to this field too. There's also obviously a lot to be learned about leadership from the Jesuit way of proceeding that has evolved subsequent to his time here. And I would say it's important to add that Ignatian spirituality is not just the domain of St. Ignatius or the Jesuits, but a global Ignatian family who've all been contributing to that conversation and to how we practice that spirituality. As someone who works with young adults, I personally believe that Ignatian spirituality is really well suited to the times that we live in. It's a spiritual tradition that demonstrates a kind of a spaciousness that can create both a shared language. We all know about the Jesuit language. You go to a Jesuit school, you speak their special language sometimes. But it also provides a kind of an openness and adaptiveness to very diverse contexts around the world. As many of the young adults have written about who've done CLA, it feels like a spirituality that's really designed for the 21st century, but it's been serving people for 5 centuries. So to start, I think for those of you who have this interest, even a cursory look at the leadership literature over the past few decades demonstrates that we are really in the midst of a kind of a historical shift in what we know about effective leadership and the best practices of leaders. And to sort of boil it down to brass tacks, you can think of it as the shift from what was often called the great man approach, right? So the charismatic leader, the central figure. So many of our biographies are about the person who led the organization, kind of deifies them as this person single-handedly moved heaven and earth and made things happen. And there's some value in obviously continuing to learn what their contributions were and how they did what they did. But over time in the modern era, there's been a shift. There was a shift towards the leader as a kind of an expert. It's been called the technocrat leadership revolution by some people, and this idea of, in order to lead an organization effectively, you need to be an expert on leadership or on an industry. And then in the late 1970s, in 1970, Robert Greenleaf published his first book on servant leadership. And in the decades since then, servant leadership has gone on to be one of the most studied aspects or paradigms of leadership in business schools. And I would say that we're in the midst of a pretty substantial fourth shift in how we think about leadership. That has sometimes been called the idea of the leader as the agent of transformation. It's an emerging concept, sometimes thrown under the title of transformational leadership, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And it's rooted in concepts that come from both management and developmental psychology, amongst many others. I also apologize for my cough. I'm just getting over COVID. So this particular change is, I think, something that is a result of many of the changes that are happening in our wider world, whether it's technology or globalization, to name just two factors. They're places in a time that's, I think, marked by increasing complexity. And that's one of the things that's discussed a lot in leadership literature is this idea of how do leaders deal with complexity. The capacity of these leaders, of all leaders, is being tested in new and in critical ways. And we often find that there hasn't been the kind of leadership development necessary to thrive in the conditions that we find ourselves. So whether it's the leader themselves, the people they lead, organizations, communities, or even nations can struggle to deal with modern complexity and the changes that are needed. So this need to evolve our understanding of leadership I think requires a more holistic view of people and organizations. I think that's being borne out more and more in the literature. Executive coaching, we talk a lot about the 4 domains of human experience: the mind, body, heart, and spirit. And I think as a modality of leadership, any modality of leadership that fails to account for all 4 of those in some way is going to prove insufficient to respond to events, for example, like the Great Resignation. I don't know about you all, but I work with a lot of leaders who are literally pulling their hair out trying to figure out how to keep their employees. And so, you know, if they can't think holistically about why those employees are leaving, in dialogue with them, then they're not going to be able to respond effectively. So the Ignatian tradition gives us what I believe to be very powerful tools for engaging both our emotional, spiritual, and intellectual lives, or maybe less so our bodies, but we'll get better at that, I think, over time. The Ignatian Yoga nonprofit is doing some work in that area. I'd like to just highlight a few areas that I think our tradition is kind of interesting and evocative as we think about contemporary leadership. So many years ago, 26 years ago to be exact, I was considering becoming a Jesuit. I entered the Jesuit Associates program after having done the spiritual exercises. And I remember being in a conversation with other Jesuit associates and saying that I felt really drawn to the society in so many different ways, but it was in particular this idea of being a contemplative in action that captured my imagination. And it really has never let go of my spiritual pursuit and my sort of vocation, how I think of my vocation. For those of you who studied church history or have experience in other Catholic spiritual traditions, you very likely know that this idea of combining contemplative and action was in and of itself a fairly radical contribution to the life of the church. There have been many inside and outside the church who have opposed the Jesuit way of engaging with the world and continue to do so. Some of you probably know Father Patrick St. Jean, who wrote a book on Ignatian spirituality and anti-racism. We did a program with him 2 weeks ago, and at the end of the program, he got a call from one of his publishers to say that people were burning his books in part of Virginia, and they just wanted him to be aware of that. And I was thinking to myself, I don't even begin to know how to engage this idea of burning the book of someone who's talking about, prayerfully engaging. So anyway, there's also been this tendency to think of a contemplative as someone who's withdrawn or monastic. And so this idea of putting them into conversation with one or into relationship with one another was both unique and continues to be a challenge for us. And the way this connects to leadership for me is there's been a lot of attention in recent years around this idea of navigating polarity in the leadership literature. So polarities are understood to be seemingly opposite states that can cause conflict or pain points in organizations. And if you think about it, you all are familiar with polarities all the time, even if that's not the sort of word that you would use. What makes them particularly challenging is they have to, by definition, coexist in order to achieve optimal outcomes. So an example would be in an organization, someone advocating for we have to focus on quality, while someone else says we have to focus on cost. You have to do both those things in order to achieve optimal outcomes. Similarly, you can have someone who says, I'm a detail person, and their supervisor saying, I need you to be a big picture person, or vice versa. We create these binaries in our mind that there are somehow, I can only do one of these two things. So research into polarities tells us that these seemingly opposite things are in fact interdependent upon one another. And a person or an organization that leans too hard into one side of that will ultimately need to develop the ability or the capacity to lean into the other polarity. Transformational leaders are described as people who have the ability to identify, reflect upon, and navigate different ways of engaging these polarities. So if you view it through the lens of polarity management, Ignatius is at the very beginning, Ignatius's call to be contemplatives in action is a kind of a remarkable thing. He baked right into the original DNA of the Society of Jesus, this idea of rejecting the binary and finding a third way or a different way of engaging with the world, being both a contemplative and someone who's engaged, someone who's active. I think he understood that contemplation allows us to renew our active lives, and that our active lives offer us ample experience for a richer, deeper experience of contemplation. Another area beyond beyond the simple idea of polarities, where I think Ignatius, we can find echoes of Ignatius in contemporary thinking about leadership, is something I mentioned a little earlier, which is complexity and adaptability. If you're familiar with Ron Heifetz, his work on developing leaders who can respond to adaptive challenges has been heavily studied in business schools over the last 20 years. And more recently, there is a developing literature on the idea of adult development theory and how we, this idea used to be that children, we can develop children, we'll build pedagogical models around children, but once you get to a certain age, that's who you are. And more contemporary developmental psychology is showing us that that is not the case, that adults can actually do have ample capacity to continue to develop new skills, new abilities, new ways of engaging the world around them. And so as we think about leadership and the need to be able to be adaptive, I believe that Ignatius's life is a good narrative of a developmental process that can help us to understand some of the necessary, let's say, dispositions needed for contemporary leaders. It so happens it was 501 years and 5 days ago today that the cannonball ripped through Ignatius's leg in Pamplona, putting a very painful and abrupt end to all the plans that a man who was known as Inigo at the time had for himself and his entire life. Something we commonly refer to as his cannonball moment. And this idea of sort of what do we do with our cannonball moments? In that moment, the story of Ignatius's life and everything subsequent to that moment had to change. And he started a journey wherein he attempted to see himself as somebody who was ever responding to God's will, which is in and of itself a kind of a developmental process. That openness to explore is one of the conditions for adult development. I think too often we all get fixated on what we want or what we've used to succeed thus far and don't want to change. And as a matter of fact, some of you probably know the work, I think it's immunity to change, and they do a program at Harvard Business School around immunity to change, saying it's one of the necessary conditions for leaders to overcome is, but I do it this way. And so what happens when you have this cannonball moment and you're forced to rethink the entire journey of your life moving forward? That ability to adapt, but also I want to highlight the incredible complexity that was happening in the time of Ignatius. Again, something that's sometimes hard for us to look back. We live I didn't have the internet until I was in college. I didn't have email until I was out of college. And now I spend the entire day doing those two things, it seems. So things have changed, needless to say. But interestingly, 501 years ago today, 4 days after the cannonball moment for Ignatius, the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire published the Edict of Worms, which many people consider the beginning of the schism that that was part of the Protestant Reformation. And so if you really think about what happened to Ignatius, not only did all sort of his hopes and dreams about being a soldier and being at court come to an end so hard, so quickly, and so painfully, but the entire world in which he lived, which we sometimes refer as Christendom, right? Like this idea of a ubiquitous sort of Catholic Europe, it began to change radically at that same exact moment in his life. When most of us are in the midst of those kind of tribulations, we fall back on the things that we know. Ignatius leaned into the complexity of the moment, right? So I think you can reasonably argue that we're experiencing increasing complexity on a different order of what Ignatius did. But the changes that he lived through were really unprecedented in the history of Europe at the time. So it's precisely his context and the manner in which he engaged the signs of the times around him that made it possible for the early Society of Jesus to succeed. And I say engage rather than confronted because too often, it's not entirely wrong, but Ignatius is often described as a counter-reformer, but really he was creating a new way of being in the church that has proven really fruitful for millions and millions of people over the last 5 centuries. I've talked a little bit about transformational leadership, and then I'm going to just flesh this out a little bit more, and then I want to move into some specific things that I pull out of the Ignatian spiritual tradition that I think is useful. Transformational leadership is generally understood to be an approach that fosters healthy change and growth in individuals, organizations, and systems. So transformational leaders are people who support meaningful development in others by being attentive to the needs of the people they serve, whether it's their professional capacity or their personal needs. They create environments that are informed by a sense of shared purpose, higher morale, and a greater level of commitment. The research on transformational leaders shows that their primary value in whatever context they're in is relationships. So that allows for a much deeper understanding of the people they lead, which fosters greater trust and increased accountability. And of course, depending on how you measure it, you could say it's necessary for optimal outcomes too. I think there's a lot in the Ignatian tradition that we can learn about transformational leadership and some of the mindsets that are necessary to be effective. First and foremost, as I said, a transformational leader is someone who's attentive to the needs of others. So if we, as members of Alpha Sigma Nu, you all know this well. Right at the heart of Jesuit pedagogy is the concept of cura personalis, this holistic approach. How are we being attentive to the whole person? It's not simply, managing the 8 hours or 7 hours or whatever it is that they're on the clock. It's how as leaders are we paying attention to the totality of their lives to the extent that we can do that within healthy boundaries. I also think that this idea of cultivating a sense of purpose is something that's, again, baked into the DNA of the society and Ignatian spirituality. In the program one of the programs I oversee, Contemplative Leaders in Action, one of the very first exercises we do with our young adult participants is have them write their own version of the first principle and foundation, wherein Ignatius describes really what his mission is. And we have them use that as a bit of a touchstone throughout their 2 years in the program, this idea of what is it I'm being called to and how do I live authentically in this moment? That is there's a whole other body of literature on authentic leadership, but that sense of purpose and mission is absolutely necessary for a leader in order to kind of foster a culture of shared purpose in the organization. It's something that was part of the constitutions. It's something that's built into Jesuit pedagogy. It's something that we think about in our thinking, our reflections on vocation and calling, and our response to the love of God in Ignatian spirituality. I would also suggest that if you don't have a sense of purpose, that you can't seek the Magis. I, as an alum of St. Joe's University, I am proud of many, many things, but probably one of my least favorite things was I'd be in the airport or in 30th Street Station in Philadelphia, and the marketing campaign would say, running a really good track time, that's the Magis, or the hawk flapping its wings, that's the Magis. And I just put my hands in my head and be like, no, like that's not the Magis that we were talking about. But I do like the idea that it was trying to encourage people to think of this idea of the greater, seeking something beyond where we are in the moment. But we have to have identified our sense of purpose, our principle and foundation, and that of the community we serve if we're going to seek it. And then the last thing I'll say about transformational leadership is it is heavily focused on relationships. And I take a lot of comfort. I have some background working with other religious communities and have had the chance to study the history of a number of their founders. And almost always there is more than one person who deserves the credit for the success of the community. But what I particularly love about the story of the Jesuits is that, yes, Ignatius was this seminal figure, but we always say in that second breath, and the first companions, the early companions, right? It was that community that was built on affection and shared commitment and truly love for one another that made it possible for them to do the important work that they were doing and to create this new way of being in the church and in the world. One of my favorite examples of that is the Jesuit who was supposed to be sent to the missions in India had to be recalled because he wasn't feeling well. And Francis Xavier, who many consider to be Ignatius's closest friend, turned to Ignatius and they decided that he would go and serve. And knowing very likely that they'd never see each other again. And one of the things I didn't know until a few years ago was the correspondence they maintained, because he knew that in order to sort of serve the community and to serve the mission of the society, they had to maintain this depth of relationship. And so there was an intimacy and an affection. As a matter of fact, I just learned, it was a bit sad that Ignatius's last letter to Xavier, Francis Xavier, was actually sent. Francis Xavier had died by the time it arrived there. And if you get a chance to read it, it's really quite tender, and I think it's worth looking at too. The last thing I want to say about relationships is I think the presupposition, this idea of generously approaching others, I'll secularize it really quickly, but kind of giving people the benefit of the doubt that that Ignatius advises to directors who are directing others in spiritual direction. I think it's an absolutely essential tool for leaders today. This idea of assuming the best, assuming generous intent on behalf of others. If you are familiar with the work of Brene Brown, who's a sociologist who's been really having a moment in the last few years, she's got podcasts and books and specials on Netflix, and one of the things, she loves the Jesuits, by the way, but one of the things that she says in one of her first books that I really struggled with for a number of years was she was upset with somebody, and one of her children, I believe it was one of her children, said, Mom, they're doing the best they can. And she kind of pulled back from her immediate response to the moment and has adopted that as a worldview, like people are doing the best they can. And I was struggling with it. And my friend Sam was basically like, well, that's the presupposition, right? He's like, isn't that like, you're okay with it over in the spiritual spot, but not when it's your employees? And I was like, oh, so I think it does contribute to our concept of how we can be more authentic leaders. I want to just spend a few more minutes talking about some of what I call the big three things that we can learn from the graces of Ignatian spirituality. In our programs, the gift of Ignatian spirituality that we weave throughout everything is that of discernment. The Pope Francis, his own zeal for discernment is such that he is encouraging cultivating the capacity for discernment in clergy around the world, in developing programs for more and more people to learn how to do discernment. The Jesuit Curia in Rome sponsors a discerning leaders program run by Father Dave McCallum, who was formerly at Syracuse, who's one of the leading thinkers on Ignatian leadership. And there's so much that could be said about discernment, and I'm not an expert by any means, but I think that there's so many gifts that discernment brings into our personal and professional lives when it becomes habitual. But I'm going to quote from Father Warren Sazama, a Jesuit, who describes these necessary conditions for really authentic discernment as he sees them laid out in the spiritual exercises. So the first is just developing a capacity for openness. Generosity is the second. Courage is the third. Interior freedom. Habitual reflection on one's experience is fifth. Having one's priorities aligned. I'm condensing some of the words here. And lastly, not confusing the ends with the means. If we didn't know that was written in the context of the spiritual exercises and it was just given as a 7-point list for how to be a good leader, I think that would be a really effective starting place. What's fascinating about it is Father Sazama isn't suggesting, and what I read, he wasn't suggesting like, if you do discernment, you'll get these things. He was saying you have to cultivate these things in order to do discernment well. And I think that is a important sort of approach to it, even for us as leaders, this idea of if we cultivate these capacities in ourselves, then our ability to look at the circumstances we're in and respond in a way that is aligned with the purpose of, let's say the organization or the company that you're part of, becomes clearer and clearer over time. But these are preconditions for doing it well consistently. I also want to emphasize this idea of this habitual reflection. It's very hard to measure the effectiveness of spirituality programs for the long term, but one of the things that we do is we ask people a few years sometimes after they do our programs, what was your big takeaway? And almost without fail, the number one takeaway is, I still do the examen every day. Spend a couple minutes at night or I spend a couple minutes in the morning if my kids are still asleep, or whatever their way of doing it is, and whatever their process is. And what that develops in each of us is this idea of carving out time for reflection on a daily basis. And I think that that's in a world often described as chaotic, that's incredibly important. I also want to, this idea of interior freedom, I want to highlight that as a real something that's particularly important for leaders in complex times. This idea of Ignatian indifference, which, as you all know, is not I don't care, right? But it's to use a more secular term, this idea of detachment, especially from the ego of something. What that cultivates, that it offers leaders, to me, is freedom. It's a freedom to take risk. It's a freedom to be brave. It's a freedom to do things that are outside our comfort zones or are outside the norms. If you read Charles Duhigg's book on habits a few years ago, he talked about the CEO was brought into Alcoa, the steel company, and they weren't doing particularly well at the time. And it was his first time speaking at the shareholders meeting, and everyone expected him to come out and say, here's my multi-point process for how we're going to get things better. And what he came out and said simply is, I'm going to make this the safest organization in the world. And the shareholders were like, well, how am I going to make money doing that? Right. And he talked about, I had to come in, I had to be free to change the culture of the organization. And the only way I was going to do that is to commit to the employees that I cared about their well-being. Ultimately made it a hugely profitable company while he was still there. So I think that interior freedom, however we achieve it, this idea of indifference to our ego, an attachment to, again, to secularize it, attachment to the purposes of the mission is incredibly important. And then the last thing I'm going to say, and before I kind of wrap up, is praying with our imagination. This was a hard one for me. I remember doing the exercises when I was in college, and I feel like I grew up in a home that was we were very well invited to share our emotions, but this idea of sitting at the foot of the cross and having a conversation with Christ was not something that I had been used to. And I really struggled with imaginative prayer for many years until it became really central to my own spirituality. And what I find is that if we can move beyond this idea of the imagination as something childlike and think of it as the capacity to put ourselves in hold multiple perspectives and to think in ways that we have not done before, it really creates the space for creativity and innovation. And if there's a word that's overused in the management and leadership literature in recent years, it's innovation, right? How do we become more innovative? We have to engage different perspectives. We have to engage ideas that we haven't had before. So there's a lot there, and I know we glossed over a lot of it quickly, but I think there's so much in this tradition that can be of value to us as we think about how we try to lead in the world we're in. I would definitely suggest it's not a perfect tradition, and I would be sad if people perceived it as an Ignatian gloss on leadership or a leadership gloss on Ignatian spirituality. I think it's important for us to acknowledge there's been a lot of failures of leadership in this tradition. I love the fact that the society is trying to become more proactive around its history, especially around Indigenous people or the history of slavery. But it's important to acknowledge that there are places that these dots don't connect with one another. And then just as a little example of imaginative prayer and how it speaks to leadership, I just thought I'd share a very quick personal anecdote. I came to the Office of Ignatian Spirituality in 2015, and I had done a lot of work in leadership development, but I really was still struggling about a year later to say, like, how am I leaning into the Ignatian spirituality piece of this? And I was down in Charlotte speaking to a group of folks, and was writing some notes about what I wanted to say, and was trying to use imaginative prayer as an entry point to how I would explain my own vocation and my own call to leadership. And the year before that time, my first wife had just passed away unexpectedly. And I was praying around that, and I was praying around Ignatius, and I had this vision of Ignatius described himself as a lifelong pilgrim. And I thought it's so interesting to think of somebody whose leg had been shattered, who almost certainly had a limp every day of his life for the remainder of his life, to describe himself as a lifelong pilgrim in a time when pilgrimage meant walking everywhere. And so everything Ignatius accomplished from 1521 on was done with this daily reminder of a wound that was never going to fully go away, but changed his life for the better. And when I started to think of my own experience and my own grief and the wound, but what it opened up for me as possibility, the freedom to, let go of what I thought was going to be my life and to enter into a new way of being in my life, it's yielded things I could never have imagined. It's yielded things for, I think, the people who work for me that I never could have imagined. I recently was remarried again. And so I think there's the creative freedom, the possibilities that open up for us when we sort of embrace our history, but also try to develop new and innovative ways or creative ways to engage with our spirituality in the context of our work is very important. So I'll end there and just say thank you so much for listening to me talk for so long. And if anyone has any comments or feedback or questions, I'd love to hear from you.
See if any hands come up. I know I have. Oh, there you go, Kevin. I'll go ahead and you just need there.
Thank you. I'm actually a guest from the Creighton University chapter, so thankful to be here. I do have a question for you, Sean, a little bit more around discernment, and to what degree do you utilize call for discernment to push all the way through to consolation, desolation in the process of decision making? Does that make sense?
I think so. And please tell me if I don't capture it properly in my response. I think, well, in one of the sort of epiphanies for me in recent years is, I had walked away from the exercises doing when I was young, and I had this abbreviated version. And really, in more recent years, when I've been able to explore more fully, it's this idea of starting with the idea of discernment as being between goods, and I guess I had just sort of boiled it down to this very simplistic sort of like, you got to pick the right thing. And I think this idea of spending time identifying what the goods are, why they're goods, and then obviously the consolation and desolations and the movement of the spirits around that. For me, when we talk about discernment with the young adults, sort of what I draw on is this idea of being an ongoing process. If I feel like I'm fully done with the discernment, that's usually an indication that I haven't done something right. And so not that we can't achieve some clarity and some sense of purpose and act on it, but the choice and the action that subsequently follows itself should be the subject of ongoing reflection. I think that, and then if we become habitual about our reflection, whether it's through the exam or other forms of prayer, I think we can build that in such a way. Does that capture what you're trying to say, Kevin? Or if I missed it, please tell me.
Well, I love your tying through to the examine and thinking the decision-making process through. No, it's just more the notion of how we receive consolation, or how we feel consolation and desolation. It is that kind of fundamental and just simply integral to the discernment process.
Yeah, I think it is. Thank you for clarifying it too. I think it is. And, it's actually a whole other area that we could have explored today is another major area in the leadership literature in recent years has been emotional intelligence, right? And so this ability about how do we receive the consolations, desolations, even developing the awareness that they're there, I think is a profoundly important capacity. And then also the ability to recognize them often as emotional states rather than permanent states of being. I think discernment, it's necessary to do discernment well, but I also think discernment gives us the ability to do that better, that idea that they're states of being. And in other contexts, mindfulness does the same thing. But one of the things that once we get someone to say, like, I do reflection, then I often, especially in my coaching where I can't talk about religion, I'll say, like, okay, in that moment where you're feeling really stressed out going to a meeting, what if you took 30 seconds to ask yourself why? And what does it mean if I wasn't? Like, imagining a different way of being. And I have a client who works in a large healthcare system who basically said, I don't need coaching anymore. That one thing, just pausing to realize that it was just a feeling I was having. It wasn't a reflection of who I am as a person. Literally was a game changer. So I think it's developing that emotional awareness. And Ignatius was revolutionary, encouraging a society of men to say, like, pay attention to your feelings. I mean, that's not something that was happening a lot in the 16th century. I'm Irish Catholic. It wasn't happening a lot in my family. So
Great. Thank you, Sean.
thank you.
Anyone else? Great question, great answer. I know I was thinking, Sean, while I was listening to you, it's graduation season, and our young members are leaving their Jesuit institutions and going out into the working world. And what advice would you give to them outside of some of the wonderful advice you've been giving here already to new graduates on this topic?
So my first wife and I both went to St. Joe's, and we had really, really different experiences. I was all in on campus ministry and retreats, and I did the exercises. And I remember having a conversation with her a couple of years after we got married, and she said, "I didn't know there was a campus ministry, right?" So I guess it would depend on which graduates I was talking to, right? Is it the folks who have some sense of this, or is it some folks who just there was something in the ether and I wasn't fully aware of it? To the latter, I would say, there's more there than maybe you were led to believe, and speaks to your possibly, your life outside of your faith in ways that you couldn't. And I might simply encourage them to start with someone who's very accessible, like something by Jim Martin, or a podcast like the Jesuitical podcast, just to say, like, this stuff connects dots in ways that I would really encourage you to be open to. And for the former, for those who I think tried to engage this spirituality during their time, I would actually go the opposite way, which is to say, you've had this profound experience, let it speak, let your secular lives, let your lives outside of your prayer and your worship also speak to this, so they can inform one another. Because I mentioned I was a philosophy and fine arts, but I was the long-haired hippie who was like, the business school is bad, right? And now I go and I talk at business schools about, like, how can we allow our spirituality to infuse our corporate lives, and vice versa. So I think it would just depend on which groups of young folks I was talking to. There is something in the chat. Lauren asked about book recommendations about Ignatian leadership. I think probably the one book length treatment that I could recommend to you is Chris Lowney's book, Heroic Leadership. There's other takes on Ignatian leadership, and I think they're important. There's an article that's written, I can't remember the journal it was in, by Karen Botto, Botto, and Ron Dufresne, who's at St. Joe's. He's a management professor at St. Joe's, which talks about this idea of how we love people as part of Ignatian leadership. That's a somewhat different take than Chris's take, but they're all valuable, and they're all part of that dialogue that is happening around Ignatian leadership. And then I mentioned Father Dave McCallum, who's in Rome with the Discerning Leaders program. You can find some of his articles online, and you can also sign up for the reflections from the Discerning Leaders program. They're all contributing in really meaningful ways to this. In terms of podcasts, I don't know that there is a particular podcast I would mention. For those of you who are here, you probably know about the AMDG podcast that's sponsored by the Jesuit Conference. One of my former students, I was his youth minister when he was 12, is the host of that podcast. He's now an adult with 4 children of his own. And he does a phenomenal job of talking to people about how Ignatian spirituality and Jesuit pedagogy have informed various different aspects of their lives. So when it comes to that idea of the cura personalis and holistic approach, I think AMDG does a really nice job with that. I also think you can, I know this is not a very elegant solution, but you can actually like Google podcasts, Jesuits and leadership. That's how I found out Brene Brown knew Jesuits. Like, I was listening to her do someone else's podcast, and they were like, "You ever heard of the Jesuits?" She's like, "Heard of the Jesuits?" So she starts to talk about what she's learned from their tradition too. So not one specific podcast, but I think there's some things out there. It's a pretty nascent field too.
What would you say, Sean, to someone whose boss or leader is not a transformational leader, and who graduated from one of our Jesuit institutions and has been kind of used to this, in that kind of leadership, maybe as a student, and now they're out in the working world, like, what would you say to them?
It's a great question. I mean, I think it's probably likely that most of us don't work for transformational leaders. When transformational leadership literature first was being researched, I can't remember the author. There was a publication. There's an article published in Harvard Business Review that is one of the sort of early articles on this topic, and they called transformational leaders the alchemists, people who encourage change. And they found in their study that it was less than 1% of leaders at the time. Now, that was about 15, 20 years ago, and I think the numbers have gone up, but it's still a small percentage of people who are in leadership roles. I would suggest two things. One is not being afraid to ask for the kind of holistic leadership that you need. I think there's especially young adults, there's leverage right now, right? There's leverage in terms of the workplace that didn't exist for those who graduated in 2008, for example. I think the ability to be articulate about sort of needs, I think is important, and it helps if it's done in the right way. You can actually help the leader, you can manage up and help the leader develop certain capacities. I cannot tell you guys how many people call me on a monthly basis to say, I don't know how to talk to fill in the blank, millennial, Gen Z. And I'm always like, they're just human beings, right? Like there's not like a rocket science here. But I would also say trying to develop those capacities in themselves, right? And so I think this idea of modeling, even if it's modeling for those above us, is important. And it's one that can, it's probably the fastest track for a leader to change, is to see something in their direct reports, for example, that they can recognize as a possible gap in themselves. And then the reality is sometimes that's not going to happen. There's still sometimes people who are stuck in a very ego-driven model of leadership. And if that's the case, there's fairly little that you might be able to do, but be attentive to your own needs.
Well said.
Thanks.
Kurt Sampson.
Yeah, proud Creighton alumni, thank you. A question, I'm going to say, 10, 15 years ago, there was a concept of servant leader as opposed to transformational leader, which rang true to me with the concept of men and women for others, right? Which is part of what we talk about in the Ignatian sense. Is there a sense of pushing or leading from behind, getting the most out of your team that blends an Ignatian concept with that concept of transformational leader, where you set a common purpose and it can kind of trickle down leadership and lead the organization in that fashion, versus taking real good care of your people as individuals and ensuring that the sense of their personal purpose is aligned with an organization's purpose, which I find to be really, really important and often overlooked, to try to find that right fit, because rarely is that the case, right? No. I'm just wondering if there's something, and again, I think the concept of servant leadership was way overblown. It got out of the secular world, too many people call themselves that, but I'm talking about the reality of doing that in the context of the transformational leadership.
No, thank you, Kurt. Great question. My colleague, Kevin O'Brien, not the Jesuit, Kevin O'Brien, the layperson who works at OAS, is a very proud Creighton alum. So he's going to be pumped to know that the two people who've said something so far are also Creighton folks. I would, 2 months ago, we had a workshop for CLA, and we had the executive director of the Robert Greenleaf Center for Servant Leadership was our speaker. And really what that workshop ended up being is how much these two ways of thinking about leadership can talk to each other and contribute to one another. And I agree. I think the servant leadership, the stuff that Greenleaf wrote, I think was really seminal. And I think it got kind of watered down and became everything for everyone for a little while. But, my friend Mike Barkley, who I think maybe has spoken out with or done some work with Alpha Sigma Nu in the past. He's the former CEO of Kind, the food company, and he still continues to, or it was until they sold it recently, but he continues to find it, servant leadership is a really important paradigm for expressing his Ignatian spirituality. And so I think the conversations that Mike and I have had and the conversations that took place in that workshop I mentioned were this idea of the imagery might not be in transformational leadership leading from behind, but I think this idea of being super attentive to the needs, capacities, and development of your people is a kind of servant leadership, right? It's basically putting the relationship with them at the forefront of your leadership style. And so I think in that sense, that's the piece that cultivates the safety and the trust necessary for somebody to buy into the mission of the organization, whether it's nonprofit or for-profit. And I think we see that, right? We see inspirational leaders get different kinds of outcomes. I have a friend who was working for Facebook in a pretty senior role until recently, and switched over to Google in the last year. And when I asked him why, he said, because I could. Like, it was the first chance I could like go someplace where like I talked to somebody who was like, what do you really want to accomplish with your life? And so I think that's the nexus for me, Kurt, is this idea of putting people at the forefront of our leadership. And again, in the same way that we said that this precondition for discernment is not confusing the ends with the means. The end might be optimal performance from the organization, but the means would be the care for the people in the organization, whether it's for profit or nonprofit.
Cool. All right. Thank you. That's
Thank
helpful.
you.
John, do you have your hand up?
Yeah.
Last question, probably.
Okay. So my question just relates to the kind of recent development in, I guess, corporate America of a lot of businesses really emphasizing meditation, mindfulness. And what's interesting about this push is it kind of coincides with the massive decrease in church attendance. And so it seems like businesses, recognizing that people still have these spiritual needs, are kind of trying to step in and fill this role. And I guess, I see this as an opportunity to potentially go beyond language of mindfulness and meditation and nudge, corporate America towards a more Ignatian disposition. But, of course, recognizing that people have lots of different religious backgrounds, and, it can't, it might not necessarily be overtly Catholic, but, I guess my question for you is just how, what advice would you give to people in business who are trying to make that nudge and towards a more Ignatian disposition, in the business world?
Yeah, thank you, John. I'm a practitioner of mindfulness. I agree with you. It is something that is being promulgated all over the place in schools, and I think for good reason. It definitely decreases stress. It helps people, respond to sort of the amygdala hijack, or the emotions take over. But I think one of the reasons so many people are attracted to this tradition is the centrality of discernment, right? And the ability to make good, well-informed, well-reasoned, morally informed choices. I think that's something, again, maybe I'm missing something, but as a practitioner of mindfulness, that's not part of my practice, but it is part of my Ignatian spirituality practice. And I think, so that's a really helpful thing, that you need not be Catholic, Christian, to begin to engage some of those ideas. Obviously, we change it when we take Christ out of the equation. I acknowledge that too, but I think Ignatian spirituality has some really unique advantages. Some that we mentioned, I'll tell you, a lot of the young adults that we engage with are no longer identifying as members of a church. Now, obviously, one of our goals is to help them rebuild that relationship. But what I find so fascinating is how they still are really hungry for Ignatian spirituality. And part of that is discernment. And I think another part of it is this sense of purpose and mission, that, again, mindfulness, this idea of clearing, this idea of letting go, this idea of focusing on the breath, powerfully important. But I also think having a sense of what your purpose is and your mission in life is what gets you through some really difficult times, right? And so I think the Ignatian tradition offers tools for cultivating both those aspects. I hope that was helpful.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
All right, everybody. Great questions. Great presentation, Sean. A lot of great information here. And I hope everybody enjoyed this. We at Alpha Sigma Nu thank you, Sean, for spending an hour with us and answering our questions. And I hope everybody enjoyed this and has a great rest of their day.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate being with you.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you, Amy.
Thank you, Sean. It was great. And I'm going to follow up with an email with you in a minute here. So, but
Okay.
thank you so much for, this is perfect. Great.
Good. I'm glad. Thanks so much. Have a great day.
All right. You too. Take care.